Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Follow us, by the way, on twitter.com/UNC knowledge. Twitter.com/UNC knowledge. Our guest today is Dr. Harry Jaffa. According to Yale political scientist Stephen Smith, Harry Jaffa is, quote, the greatest living scholar of Lincoln's political thought and Lincoln's greatest defender, period, close quote. Now a distinguished fellow at the Claremont Institute, Dr. Jaffa majored in English at Yale, took his doctorate at the New School where he studied with the legendary political philosopher Leo Strauss. 50 years ago, he published Crisis of the House Divided, an interpretation of the issues in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And 9 years ago, in 2000, he published the sequel, A New Birth of Freedom, Abraham Lincoln and the Coming of the Civil War. In this 200th anniversary year since the birth of Abraham Lincoln, Professor Jaffa, welcome. Segment 1, 1800 and 1860. You begin A New Birth of Freedom by contrasting these two election years, 1800 and 1860, possibly the most contentious in American history. Quote, why did those, quoting you in New Birth of Freedom, why did those who failed to carry the presidential election of 1860 not accept the outcome, as did the defeated Federalists of 1800? But you call the fact that the Federalists in 1800 accepted that outcome an astounding precedent. So let's begin with 1800. Why did they accept? Why did the defeated Federalists, Adams versus Jefferson, Jefferson wins, Adams goes quietly home to Massachusetts and accepts the result?
Well, one of the points that I make is that to the best of my knowledge, the election of 1800 in the United States was the first time in human history that a government changed hands on the basis of a free election. It had never happened before.
It had never happened before.
So the reason why the election of the 1790s was so intense is that no one really knew whether the election would decide the question, whether the losers in the ancient world, if you were a loser, you got killed or exiled, or you overthrew the government. There was no real theory which made the majority in a popular election the decisive factor. And of course, the majority by itself was not itself sufficient. Jefferson, there was nobody who was more what shall I say, seemed more reluctant to accept the possibility of a Federalist victory in 1800 than Jefferson. But it was Jefferson who drew the lesson that he himself did not draw before the election, when he said we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. Not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle. But he left open the question, if there was a difference of principle, could you accept the victory of the other side?
Which takes us to 1860, quoting you again. How could a people bred in the cause of union and republicanism have come to such a pass? The pass being the election of 1860, where 10 states refused even to put Lincoln or his electors on their ballot. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Lincoln is elected and the South secedes. Yes.
Well, I'd say that there are two factors. One is the Industrial Revolution. In 1793, with the invention of the cotton gin, the cultivation of cotton became enormously important, not merely to the United States, but to the whole Western world. The same year the power loom was invented, and Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations.
Right.
But the value of slave labor was enormously increased, and slavery received a tremendous impetus by the fact that the cotton economy was the most vital economy, most vital production in the whole Western world. The other thing that happened, parallel to this, and in the long run more important, was the fact that the idea of nature. Remember, the Declaration of Independence appeals to the laws of nature and of nature's God.
Yes.
And this belief was supplanted. Nature was replaced by history. And in April of 1861, but halfway between Lincoln's inauguration and the firing on Fort Sumter, the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, his real name was Alexander Hamilton Stephens, and Jefferson Davis's real name was Thomas Jefferson Davis. So Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were president and vice president of the Confederacy. He made a speech in which he said that at the time of the founding, the belief in the equality of races was almost universal, and the concessions made to slavery in the Constitution of 1787 were reasonable guarantees, but the expectation was that in the course of time, slavery would wither away and die.
Right.
But, said Stephens, we know better. They were wrong. Science, the progress of science has taught us the inequality of the races. And we in the Confederate States of America is the first nation built upon this is called this cornerstone speech. And the cornerstone phrase is taken in the New Testament. And the cornerstone in the Gospels is Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ becomes the symbol of slavery the positive slavery was regarded as at best a necessary evil in 1776. By 1860, a large part of the country, north as well as south, believed that slavery was a benign institution and supported by both God and history.
Segment 2, ordained by God. Again, I quote you in A New Birth of Freedom. Quote, for both Jefferson and Lincoln, a regime in which the majority alone may rule is nonetheless a regime sharply circumscribed by a moral order ordained by God. Close quote. Explain.
Well,
how is this continuity from Jefferson to Lincoln? In a crisis, in your first book, Crisis of a House Divided, you weren't so sure there was that Lincoln is the one who sees clearly that the moral order must circumscribe popular sovereignty.
Well, I think a little while ago I quoted Jefferson's, can the liberties of a people be thought secure when we have abolished their only sure foundation, the belief they are of the gift of God and may not be violated but with his wrath? That was Jefferson's opinion. That was what Lincoln expressed in his second inaugural.
All right, now this leads to a pretty tricky question, I think. We'll see if you find it tricky. I have a feeling you grade my questions down. William F. Buckley said that in passing, Whittaker Chambers once remarked that democracy was a political reading of the Bible. And you quote in A New Birth of Freedom, famous Catholic writer Burke Cochran, who writes that if it was inevitable that if civilization became Christian, two results must follow: the substitution of free labor for slave labor and the erection of free institutions on the ruins of despotic institutions in government. So the question to you, Dr. Jaffa, is, do you see democracy as a specifically Judeo-Christian development? And then, of course, the obvious second question is, can it exist once faith in Judaism and Christianity dissipates?
I would say it's Judeo-Christian, but both Judaism and Christianity at some point in their development became rational, found in reason the will of God. So the Judeo-Christian tradition understood as a triumphant success of reason as well as of faith. And I would say that the God of the Declaration of Independence, the essence of God is known by reason. Because the Declaration, by saying that all men are created equal, distinguishes the equality of human beings as members of a species from the beasts which are below and from God who is above. Jefferson, in the last letter he wrote, but something which was a traditional in English political theory, that it is now no longer that some men, it is thought that some men are born with saddles on their back and others booted and spurred to ride them, see. So the rule of a rider over his horse is according to nature. The rule of a rider over another rider is against nature. And God is the author of nature, and the legitimacy of rule depends upon recognizing the order that God himself has anointed by distinguishing between man and beast.
All right.
This is all
smaller bore, for all in A New Birth of Freedom.
Yeah.
Smaller bore question. Then, if you see Western Europe, where you see the collapse of religious practice, does that concern you for the political institutions over time?
Well, if you have studied Marxism, as I did exhaustively many years ago, you know that the dialectical materialism and all that Hegelian apparatus is all important in how Marx came to his conclusion. But the aim of Marxism is a revolution which will lead to what he calls the leap into freedom, which is literally a leap into nothing. But the great enemy of human well-being, according to Marx, is morality. The society of the future is one in which the moral distinctions based upon the Judeo-Christian and Greek tradition have all dissolved. See, we are moving into a communist world. We are moving into the world that Marx wanted without knowing it and without having the kind of revolution that Marx predicted and thought was necessary. This is shown, for example, in almost all the Secretary of State, the President, they all talk about our values. And what do they mean by values? It means moral choices which have no objective basis. A value is a subjective desire, not an objective truth. They don't know what they're saying. They don't know the importance. But 100 years ago, nobody would have spoken about our principles as being values. George Washington said the basis of our policy will be laid in the immutable principles of private morality. If you said to Washington, you mean your values? What the hell are you talking about?
Back to Lincoln, A New Birth of Freedom. You've spent a lifetime thinking about this man. Let me ask a couple of obvious questions about him. One is, how did he do it? April 12, he takes office on March 4th, 1861. April 12, the Confederates open fire on Fort Sumter. April 14, the Union garrison surrenders. April 15th, Lincoln calls up 75,000 men. April 27th, he suspends habeas corpus in Maryland. He moves very fast, and this is within weeks of his taking office. You write in A New Birth of Freedom, Lincoln's reaction to the attack on Fort Sumter was as electrifying as the attack itself. Where did this come from? When he was 23, he spent a few weeks running around the wilds of Illinois in what came to be called the Black Hawk War, and that is his total military experience. Within weeks of becoming president, he's conducting a war of major proportions.
It's obvious that from the moment of his election and from the moment that secession began, he had to think of how the Union was to be preserved. And Buchanan shilly-shallied and said that Buchanan and Lincoln completely agreed on the illegality of secession, but Buchanan said, Congress has got to decide, I can't do anything on my own. Lincoln understood that, and it's interesting that all those things that you mentioned, he did without the authority of Congress. But when he called Congress into special session, he said, now pass laws authorizing what I've already done. But he said there was no, you're going to preserve the Union or not? He thought through what was necessary, and he did it. And he might have surprised himself as well. But the fact of the matter is, he knew that remember when Alexander Stevens gave his cornerstone speech in the middle of
Vice President of the Confederacy.
Right. There was no war. Sumter hadn't been fired on, and as far as Stevens was concerned, and the whole Confederate government, which was all in place. Remember, Jefferson Davis was inaugurated 2 weeks before Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
It was an operating thing. The question is, now we have to take action against something in which they have all the advantages, you might say. And one of the things I hope to make clear, even if I live long enough to write another book on Lincoln, is that any odds maker who knew the facts in 1861 would say the Confederates have got all the odds on their side.
Yes, you make this point that these days we tend to hear about the northern industrial, the larger population, bigger industrial base, more railroad tracks. Of course the North was going to win. And you say, no. It was not at all clear that the North was going to win.
But in the first place, winning for the South meant not being defeated. Winning for the Union meant wiping out the military force of the Confederacy.
Right.
It's much harder to annihilate. And remember, the land area of the Confederacy was much larger than that of at least of the contiguous states of the Union.
With Texas, right.
And
you write, if I may again quote you, on New Birth of Freedom, the worst that could have happened in the weeks ahead, this is after the dispute over Fort Sumter becomes red hot, would be for the authorities, Confederate authorities in Charleston, to have invited the Fort Sumter garrison to remain as their guests. As time passed and the two governments lived side by side, it would have become extremely difficult for Lincoln not to have acquiesced in a peaceful separation. How would the world be different if that had happened, if the Civil War had not been fought?
Well, how different would the world have been if the southern United States was on the side of Hitler?
Is that what would have happened?
Well, I mean, we're making all sorts of assumptions.
No, but I have a great mind sitting opposite me. I want to see it work.
Well,
play around a little bit.
Well, see, the general history of the Western civilization, particularly Western thought, from the 17th or 18th century to the 20th or 21st century, looks upon it in the light of the idea of progress. And Darwinianism gave a great boost to the idea of progress. And the Constitution, the people who believe in a living Constitution are basically neo-Darwinians, because they say we're moving higher and higher. We know that slavery was wrong. They didn't know it. We know that capital punishment is wrong. They didn't know it. And so the idea that of the combination of Hegel and Darwin created, whose roots, by the way, are in Rousseau, which I've said a lot about. Calhoun was a neo-Hegelian, but he was even more so a disciple of Rousseau. So the belief in the idea of progress has to a large extent obscured the fact that communism and Nazism are examples of the thought that was emerging from over those centuries. We tend to think of liberal democracy as that's the faith of the progressive movement. Liberal democracy is the wave of the future.
Right.
And then along came somebody who said, no, the wave of the future is National Socialism. And the Nazi theories, the Nazi race theories, they're rooted in 19th century liberal thought. So the fact...
So the notion that one hears from time to time that by 1920 slavery would have attenuated and been... that the Civil War was a terrible waste if the North had just held on and waited 6 decades, 7 decades, it would all have withered away to nothing, and all these millions who gave their lives would have been...
In the 1920s in this country, when I was growing up,
yes,
racism was far more virulent than it was in Germany before Hitler.
Right.
And so race theory was an outcome of the 19th century progressive thought. But the historian...
There is no reason to suppose that the South wasn't the wave of the future.
Absolutely.
All right.
And on the subject of race, by the way, even in the abolitionist movement, there was never any question but that Negroes were inferior.
Right. Segment 4 here, from the 19th century to the 20th. Actually, we're ranging over millennia. You write of the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s as the great Civil Rights Acts. And yet there was only one politician with whom you worked very closely. Mm-hmm. His name was Barry Goldwater. And as a member of the United States Senate, he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Mm-hmm. Dr. Jaffa, explain yourself.
Okay, well, I'll mention that in 1959, according to Dick, what's his name, the National Review editor who just published a book on Buckley.
Oh, Rick Brookhiser.
Rick Brookhiser.
Yes.
Brookhiser. He said that, and he quoted Buckley in 1959 as a quotation which was pure Southern racism.
Right.
And he said, that Buckley...
We wish the white race to prevail, I think. That's a rough paraphrase of Bill's position.
But that he did a 180 degrees and on the basis of my influence. Well, I didn't...
So what you're saying is you got to Goldwater a little too late, or...?
Well, I didn't get to him at all as far as that was concerned. Now, in the first place, his constitutional objections had some substance to them.
Right.
And if things had gone the way the reasons would have said they should have gone, the Voting Rights Act of 65 should have come first, because there was no question as to the constitutionality of that. And basing the...
Goldwater, nobody had trouble with the 65 Act.
I don't think...
Some Southerners did, but Goldwater didn't.
I don't think so.
Right, all right.
But in any case, my reason for changing my registration from Democrat to Republican, I did that after the Bay of Pigs, when I was disgusted with Kennedy for having the missile crisis was a direct result of his meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna, and so I was looking for a political movement which would oppose communism abroad and socialism at home.
And in 1964, Barry Goldwater delivered an acceptance speech at the Cow Palace, right up here up the road in San Francisco, at the GOP convention, in which he uttered the words, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue," which, if I may say so, strikes me as wonderful writing, but politically at the time it was considered a terrible mistake that made people very jittery and helped and contributed to the landslide of Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And the person who wrote that phrase is...
Yes, I did it.
Is Harry Jaffa.
Absolutely.
Any regrets?
No. I never wrote another speech for a president.
That was the end of that career.
I said I made a joke of the fact that I told Ronald Reagan if he'd run for president, I wouldn't write any speeches for him.
That would be your main contribution.
Right. But and first that this contributed to Goldwater's defeat, I think, is simply not true. I said that if Ronald Reagan had been the candidate in 1964, he wouldn't have gotten any more votes than Reagan. And if Goldwater had been the candidate in 1980, he would have got the same votes that Ronald Reagan did. Mm. In 1964, you had, first of all, the assassination,
right,
and the Kennedy tax cuts, where the country was prosperous. The Vietnam War was still a cloud no bigger than a man's hand. So we had peace, prosperity, and
nobody wanted a third president within 2 years.
Well, and Johnson, of course, was the first Southerner in the White House, so that really tore up the base that Goldwater had in the South.
He had the South and the liberal North.
But incidentally, Reagan in 1983 made a speech at Ashland College in Ohio, at the Ashbrook Center, I think it was a year after John Ashbrook had died, this promising young Republican, and in which he said that the principles of his administration were taken directly from the Goldwater campaign, and he ended by quoting the speech that I wrote.
Segment 5, The Present Crisis, from a recent essay by Harry Jaffa. Scalia, you're referring to Mr. Justice Antonin Scalia. Scalia says that it is up to the majority to decide whether or not abortion should be lawful. One could substitute the word slavery for abortion to see that there is no difference between Scalia's majoritarianism and the popular sovereignty doctrine of Senator Stephen A. Douglas.
Right.
You are the only person who could connect Antonin Scalia with Stephen A. Douglas. Lincoln thought slavery was wrong. He did not think that a vote of the people could make it right. Conservatism suffers from the same nihilism and postmodernism that dominate liberalism and that suppress dissent on our campuses. Close quote. Now, can I first of all give you an opportunity to say you were just feeling especially feisty that day?
No.
You're not. You really want to maintain that Antonin Scalia is a nihilist?
I'm saying that he said the whole theory of democracy is majority rule. That's the whole theory. If the people want to have abortion, then abortion should be legal. If they think it should be illegal, it should be. Now, I'm not saying that he's not a good Catholic or any, making no, but those statements by themselves are nihilistic. They say there's no foundation for the decision, and to say that there's no basis for majority rule, there's no basis for human rule of any kind, whether it's majority or aristocracy or whatever.
Your essay concludes, we have to return the conservative movement to its roots in the political thought of the American founders and Abraham Lincoln. Nothing is at stake but the salvation of Western civilization.
Well,
How do you return any significant portion of the American people, let alone a particular political movement? Let's just start with 18-year-olds who are headed off to college in September. How do you return a people to the thought of the founders and of Abraham Lincoln?
Well, I'm doing my best. And I'm not insane enough to believe that my efforts. On the other hand, if we look at human history, some great men have, and some men who are not great have had great influences if they happen to, if chance works in their behalf.
So I guess what I'm asking for here, well, look, we've got a question I have to ask, of course, is what would Abraham Lincoln have made of Barack Obama? And the underlying, I'm just going to dump a bunch of questions and let you sort them out and answer them in any order you want to. Because the other question is, are you arguing that nihilism doesn't work? That over some period of time, that at least is brief enough to save the country, there is some kind of self-correcting mechanism. I think Milton Friedman would have said you raise taxes high enough and people will see that it doesn't work and they'll vote to lower taxes. You're talking about something much, much deeper, the very premises of the civilization itself. Will people come to their senses because no alternative will work, right? Or are you saying, no, that's not necessarily the case. It's an act of will and discipline and intellect.
Well, Milton Friedman, a man whom I admire greatly, is an example of nihilism himself because he does not believe in the objective existence of morality. His support for the repeal of the drug laws, I mean, he's got a good argument that the drug laws don't work, but at the same time, he himself doesn't think there's any objective basis for anybody imposing their morality on somebody else. That's the libertarian economics, which is completely amoral.
So how do we return? How do we save ourselves?
Well, what is the root of the institutional root of evil in the world in which we inhabit? There's no question but that it's in the universities. That's where the teaching begins. That's where the high school and grade school teachers go to college, and they learn that morality is subjective, and they think that's a sophisticated thing to say. And
hold on, I have to reel that back for you and let you see and let you think about whether you want to stand with it. The institutional root of evil, you use the word evil, in the world we now inhabit, there's no question it's the universities.
Absolutely.
You're going to stick with that?
Yes.
All right.
I wrote a pamphlet on homosexuality and the natural law some years ago, and included in it was a dialogue which I claim to have. I didn't claim to. I pretended that I had found a tape that Ted Bundy had made of a dialogue with one of his victims before he murdered her, and which she pleads for her life, and says that her parents and her friends would get any sum of money to save her. And he says, but you don't understand. I don't want money. I just want the pleasure of raping and murdering you. And she says, well, don't you believe in the moral law? Don't you believe that God prohibits such things? And he says, I used to believe that until I took my first college course in philosophy. Then, wait a minute, he said, then I learned that all moral judgments are value judgments, that value judgments have no foundation in reason, and that a moral choice is simply the thing that you believe in most of all. And what I believe in most of all is the pleasure that I get from raping and murdering you.
From which argument there is no appeal.
Well,
last question.
Well, that's an example
of the reasoning.
And Bundy, in this context, quotes from a Harvard.
Are you an anomaly? Are you simply a survivor of an earlier and a better intellectual age? Or do you see, when you survey the university scene in this country, young Harry Jaffas, young Leo Strausses coming along who have at least the prospect either of transforming the scene or at least of keeping some, doing what the monasteries did in the Middle Age, at least keeping reason alive? How do you view yourself?
Well, monasteries kept more than reason alive if they
kept. That's a.
Yeah, well.
Let's not press that one. In fact, let's not press it at all. I will retract that one.
Sure.
Do you see yourself as an anomaly, as someone who is simply a visitor from an earlier and a better world?
Well, I don't. I like the world I'm living in. I think it's a world which has enabled me to live a good life and my family, and I've had access to students. And that article about me in the Review of Politics mentions that, and they said I've influenced a whole generation of students.
Generations, plural.
Yeah, well, maybe if I didn't know that, but if it's true, maybe I've been more successful than I know. But what?
Last question then: what would Abraham Lincoln have made of Barack Obama? This man to whom you've devoted so much of your life?
I've watched and read a lot of Obama's speeches. And by the way, there's an article by Charles Kessler on Obama in the CRB, which is excellent.
Claremont Review of Books.
Right. Obama's success was in representing himself as appealing to a higher principle than other politicians, and particularly ordinary politicians. He claimed to represent something much higher, which transcended the conflicts which obstructed the reforms that he thought were necessary. He never said what that higher principle was. If he'd appealed to the Declaration of Independence, he would have been doing, but he didn't even know of the existence of the Declaration of Independence. He just appealed to something higher and claimed.
But perhaps that's good as far as it goes. He represents an urge, a hunger for something higher.
Yes.
Even if he can't take people quite to it.
Well, the question is, what is it that he's taking them to? Adolf Hitler also appealed to something higher.
Right.
And I'm not sure that Obama, as far as I can tell, programmatically, he gets his ideas from the Democratic left, which
perfectly conventional left liberal.
Well, it's not so conventional. It's basically, it's the Marxism transformed into the lingo of today.
All right.
But
What Crisis of the House Divided, New Birth of Freedom, last sentence. What should an 18-year-old headed to college in September know about Abraham Lincoln?
well, if he begins with Crisis of the House Divided,
He'll know plenty. Right.
I can. Yeah, I've got my 25-cent lecture and my 50-cent lecture.
And this book is, well, on Amazon, I think you can get it for a little under $20. Harry Jaffa, author of A New Birth of Freedom. Thank you for joining us. For Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution, I'm Peter Robinson.